Long ago, the Star Union spanned across the galaxy, ruling over an Age of Wonders. But that was all changed by the Cataclysm. Their means of interstellar travel collapsed, leaving the many cultures of the Star Union alone and abandoned. Over many generations, this isolation changed them, politically, technologically, and even genetically.
Remnants of the Star Union sit on many worlds. Power plants, hydroponic farms, entertainment centers, and even hidden wonders sit dormant, waiting for new civilizations.
Under your leadership, these new civilizations seek to take these fallen worlds as their own. Will you be conquerors or diplomats? Will you lead them into a new Age of Wonders, or drag them to ruin? Their fate, and perhaps the fate of the galaxy, is in your hands. Now prepare for Planetfall.
Welcome to our review discussion of the turn-based grand strategy game, Age of Wonders Planetfall, and welcome to the Bravosity. If you enjoy the video, drop us a like, tell us in the comments what you think of AOW Planetfall, and subscribe to see more stuff like this.
I'm Brevin, and with me once again is Nathaniel from our, you've probably heard him from our Outward review, or our top 5 Fallout 3 quests, or even our Alumnus Gate review. So we're here today talking about a game that we really enjoy, AOW Age of Wonders Planetfall. It is the 4th game in the Age of Wonders series, the other ones being fantasy games, and it tries to shake up the formula of those games a bit by taking us to the sci-fi genre. Even though there's still some fantasy stuff in there, it's like science fantasy sort of genre. And it's a 4X game, or you could say 4X strategy or grand strategy. It's just a large-scale turn-based strategy game, very similar to Civilization, or what it really reminds me of is old-school Heroes of Might and Magic, 3 or 4 especially. Because, in my opinion, it's a bit more combat-focused than something like Civilization, or just some of the other 4Xs. Humankind is a newer one. But yeah, like I said, although there is diplomacy, there is multiple ways of beating the game that may not directly involve combat. This game overall is pretty focused on the combat, and so let's talk about something that I think AOW does really well. I think sort of puts it on a pedestal even above some other 4Xs like Civilization or Humankind. They don't really have their lore, their story and setting is more just, the world, just what we got going on. And we see in AOW, we have this grand science fantasy setting that I think is really interesting and rides a fine line between goofy humor and sort of like a B-movie feeling almost, this goofy sort of feeling that you see, and reminds me of like old CRPGs as well, like Fallout or Wasteland, or even like Planescape Torment is what I meant to say. They all have this really dark, serious tone that's offset by this like goofiness every now and then, and there's like a little bit of goofiness to everything in the game, and we see that in AOW Planetfall, that there is goofiness, but the humor doesn't really undercut the setting. It doesn't make the setting any less interesting, most of the time, at least.
Yeah. Another thing with the setting is, on top of it being this science fiction with fantasy-esque details,
reminds me
it also has a like post-apocalyptic setting because of the whole galaxy going through the cataclysm thing that we touched on in the intro.
Absolutely, it's got layers to it. It's post-apocalyptic. It's science fiction. It's fantasy, and there's a lot of things that play into that. The post-apocalypticness. You get the old relations between these new factions, like how their ancestors were related to each other and how that changes the way they are now. And we see that, like, most of the stuff in the gameplay has explanations in the setting and doesn't conflict with the setting, but is, like, heightened by it.
Yeah. And it's kind of like somebody, when designing this game, went through a list of checkboxes and started, like, checking off the different kind of themes they could throw in there, but it's all integrated very well. It's not like they just thrown this stuff in there without any thought. But it really does cover a very large variety of genres.
And it with each of these, like, sci-fi tropes it goes into, though, or maybe fantasy tropes sometimes, it puts, like, a unique spin on each of them. Like,
yeah.
Like, here's the Borg with the the assembly. Here's this big robotic cyborg force that's trying to assimilate entire populaces into itself. And, you know, the twist is they have, like, some of them have, like, biker stuff, and they really, like they look like zombies and stuff like that. And
yeah,
like, you have the Zerg type race, the insect race that breeds,
mainly, but melee focused.
Yeah, but they're the unique spin I see on that is that they're bipeds, and that they aren't, like, mindless. Like, they have their
mind power.
Yeah, they have
psionic powers.
They're all psychic, and they have a connection, and they aren't just villains either. That you can be diplomatic with them as well.
Yeah. Then they have, like, kind of basic humanish type stuff. Then their psionic thing kind of is what adds the fantasy element generally, because the psionic technology is something that's above most understanding, so it's like magic.
It reminds me of, like, Dune, kind of, or even, like, Thor, maybe.
Yeah, where all the magic is actually high-tech stuff that can't be explained well.
And it does a really good job at just taking those science tropes, those sci-fi tropes, and some things that might be generic, and putting an interesting spin on them with just little touches and maybe a dash of humor. Maybe you have layers, like we talked about with the post-apocalypticness. And so, like, you have this faction that may seem somewhat generic, but they have this backstory of what they were before with the post-apocalypticness. Like, we have sci-fi Amazons. Yeah. And before the Great Collapse, the Cataclysm, they were all, like, scientists, biological and genetic scientists, and they slowly got turned into that, and we have, like, a history with all of them. And what that does is it, like, makes the fantasy playing as any of these factions, or, like, being this leader, this sci-fi leader, it makes the fantasy of being that kind of leader more interesting. Like, it really puts you in the shoes. Like, this isn't a role-playing game, but it does have some role-playing elements, but the biggest thing it takes from that is giving you the fantasy of being one of these people, of being, you know, a swarm of insects, or just lots of different sci-fi tropes. And the writing is really good. There's nice little detail on each character, each unit, and locations. Like, I always find the description, the, like, paragraph, the description, interesting. I always find that interesting.
Yeah, and then if you look at the codex of different stuff, which is completely unnecessary unless you just want to look into the history of things, there's, like, little stories with every unit in most mods and all sorts of stuff like that, like locations, things like that, practically, where it'll usually have a like quotation around it, and then at the very end it looks like it's come out of some excerpt of a historical document or something like that.
Right, the
and it really gives a good service to the lore.
Right, it's like the description's coming from someone within the game.
Yeah.
And I'm a person where like I read those things if they're interesting, but if they start to bore me, I'm gonna stop reading them, and I'm probably not gonna read many of them. And I continue to read the descriptions of the units and the locations I was going to and stuff like that. So I think it is an interesting story. It has an interesting setting, and I think the writing, the humor, and all that really elevates the gameplay.
Yeah.
It would feel more generic and a lot less interesting if without that stuff.
Now, should we move to the next topic?
Yeah, this sort of goes with both things, or with what we were talking about previously. I mean, we're gonna move on to the art design.
Yeah, the Empire map is what we're going to talk about first. It's split into a lot of hexes that decides what direction you're going to move.
This is the large-scale, like 4X map, like you'd see in Civilization or other games like that.
Yeah, and the hexes kind of look like they're part of a battle map made by scanning the planet or something like that from orbit. And the UI kind of looks pretty basic. It's a lot of blues and then symbols, except for your resources that are up in the top of the screen has kind of like a metallic gold border along the edges of it. But overall, it's not a super memorable UI type art design, but the map itself is very, very well designed. Every sector has a unique environment and it looks very unique. Like a desert is gonna look pretty rocky and sandy, but you see like ruins occasionally in different areas, even in places that don't necessarily have a like location that affects the sector much. It really gives off that post-apocalyptic feel in most places because you see ruined buildings or roads that look like they're in disrepair, things like that. And overall, I think that the map is pretty well designed.
Okay, so when we're talking about the Empire map, the overall art design is pretty low detail. It's along the same lines as, what you'd get from Civilization or even Humankind. Although when comparing it to those games, to its contemporaries, its peers, I think it does better, and it's a 3 or 4 year old game at this point.
Yeah, and I think also the borders between sectors, sometimes it's kind of random. Sometimes there's really good blends between the art design of two different sectors. Sometimes the blend is very spontaneous and very obvious.
Talk about sectors. Each of the sectors does look unique, but there's only probably 5 or 6 different designs for each sector. You would say, not including landmarks. There's desert.
Think probably 7 or 8 because there's volcanic, ocean, fungus.
Yeah, and I will say I've never looked at a sector and been like, I don't know what that is. I know exactly what each sector is, and it's efficient. It does its job, and it looks pretty nice.
Then also on top of that, there's actually 2 sectors practically on top of each other in most circumstances. That's not just a tundra, but it's also mountains and a tundra. Yeah. Things like that. And usually that looks pretty good, and it makes it to where you can usually remember what a sector is or what you're going to use it for. And
but moving on from the base landscape art, let's talk about the landmarks, which all look pretty good. I wish you could zoom in a little bit more, maybe, but it seems like they're sort of trying to hide how low level of detail there is, but I don't know. Overall, the landmarks do look interesting. Each different one has a unique look. There's different factories and like artillery, and there's like casinos and stuff like that, and they all have unique looks. And you have different tiered landmarks, and the really good ones look much cooler and more interesting, and the low level ones don't quite look as interesting, but are still interesting little locations.
Yeah, like, you're very rarely going to ever be able to mix up what a landmark is with another kind of landmark. Even though they all do look the same as the same exact kind of landmark they are, generally, they don't look very similar to each other.
They all look distinct, but the question I would ask, though, is the art style overall generic? Because I really don't think it is. I think it goes above that. But I have a hard time pinpointing exactly what brings it above generic. What brings it up?
It's because there's often different kinds of themes behind the art that they use for these different locations.
But they still feel like they're from the same universe. It
Yeah.
doesn't come across as two completely different things.
Like, factories look like
worlds.
production factories specifically look like something that's really some how would I say this, like diesel punk, if you know what that is, or like steampunk but worse for the environment. That's how a lot of their production type factories look. They're like
lots of like biodomes for agricultural stuff.
For agriculture, for energy production. It looks like huge generator type things. You see like arcs of electricity going around through them.
And it does keep this science fantasy art style of going like of having these interesting and to a point fantastical things, but it's not like 40K or anything. They're not like absolutely ridiculous, giant, leap proportion, crazy things. And I think also there's an interesting separation between things that are more fantasy and fantastical and things that are more down to earth and like scientific, I suppose. Like your factories and stuff like that, you don't really see. They don't look like these fantasy factories and stuff when you get production. You don't have big pyramid factories.
I mean, even though biodomes are like something we wouldn't be seeing in the real world at all today, it's something that's pretty normal type of sci-fi type thing. It's not too fantastical, but there's certain locations that get very like fantasy-esque when you got there's some kind of cave that has psionic power bonus or something, and there's temples for the psionic people.
But let's not get too caught up on landmarks. Let's move on to, well, we can talk about first, before we move on to units, let's talk about colonies and how they look.
The colonies all look pretty distinct for their faction.
Yeah, each faction's colony looks distinct, but overall, like, your colony's going to look the same throughout the whole game. It's not, as you buy new buildings, you're not going to see too much improvement. It does...
Yeah, they do grow slightly, and you see some very, very tiny buildings pop up around the edges. And sometimes you do see some buildings farther out in the same sector as your colony, but they don't really, like, change form a lot. Overall, they just get kind of bigger.
Most of what you're going to see as your colonies grow is new roads connecting the new sectors you take, which we'll talk about how you grow colonies when we get into gameplay and stuff. But new roads showing how you connecting your colonies to new sectors, and a few new buildings as the sectors gain levels. but overall, there's really not much growth in the colony visually. But moving on from the colonies and the sectors, let's talk about the battle maps, the tactical battle maps, and the units.
The maps are once again covered with a hexagonal overlay, and generally, unless it's a wilderness styled area that the battle map is in, then you're gonna get a lot of post-apocalyptic looking scenes with broken down cars, run down buildings, just ruins of pillars and random technology. But then there's also some places like forests where you're mainly gonna have bushes and trees, and then very open desert, very open Arctic tundra, and then there's the ocean. There's not really a lot going on with the ocean, to be honest.
The water actually looks really bad, to be honest. Overall, the battle maps look decent. It's nothing near like XCOM, even if you go back to like Enemy Unknown on the 360. It doesn't even quite reach that quality. But they're trying to do a lot more than XCOM Enemy Unknown was. And the art design is decent. It's not great, I would say, especially when it comes to these battle maps. They look pretty good, somewhat generic, like I've said before. It's grand science fantasy with a layer of post-apocalypse added as well. And the writing and the setting works symbiotically with the art design. And they really support each other. And I think that's where how it gets above being generic.
Something it does have going for it, though, is most of these battle map type locations are pretty distinct from each other in their layout, even though a lot of the assets within each one is kind of generic.
I would say there's a large number of assets, though, and there's a large number of maps.
Yeah, well, the actual battle arena spots throughout the game, though, correspond to where the battle's taking place, and that includes at any major landmarks.
And those look a lot more interesting than your basic battles. And it gives weight to the larger battles and the more important battles, where you won't get that in the smaller battles. It'll be more generic, empty landscape most of the time.
Yeah, there's a few locations that are... The battle maps are only at gold tier landmarks, which we'll get to later, but I've only seen those actual battle maps, I think, once, and I've played a lot of this game.
And we also see each colony's battle map is unique and corresponds well with the design of the colony, the art design of the colony on the Empire map. But I mean, it's not all that impressive when it comes to the battle maps. It's decent, like we've said. It's above being generic. There are some more interesting ones, but even the interesting ones aren't anything to write home about, really. I wouldn't say.
I'd say there was only a few that were really super, super interesting, but I'd say that because there's so many common battle arena areas, there's so many very common ones, and those ones are the most generic. That's what kind of takes away a lot, is because only the uncommon ones are the ones that aren't as generic as everything else.
Okay, what I'll say is, even though they may look generic, there's enough distinct ones to where I don't feel like I'm not going into a fight in the same place or in a similar place, because even if it's, even if I have to go to a grasslands area to do a fight, and then I have to go to another grasslands area to do a fight, there's something probably going on in there that's going to change up that battle map a little bit and give me a little bit of a different location. But the maps are both the Empire map and the battle maps are nice, but what I think really shines when it comes to the art design is the units and the characters. I think most of them look really good, really fantastic. There's a good amount of detail for this kind of game, especially, and I think that comes from the battle maps and them having that XCOM style of battles. You want to have more detailed units.
Yeah, for sure, especially since, like, units that have similar art styles are generally part of the same faction, but there's so many different factions and sub-factions and different enemies that, like marauder groups also, that all have unique art styles that are special to that group, that having well-detailed units, it's perfect with a lot of their units, I think. Though they are not, like, super high quality resolution or anything. I kind of wish that they were a little higher quality.
But for comparing them to their peers, to the 4X genre and the strategy genre in general, I think they are equal. They are maybe even a little bit better. Better than Civilization, but like if you look at like XCOM, the graphics and animations, especially of the units, are better. But that's mainly focused on that small scale battles.
Yeah, but I think that one thing that might also be like adding to this is there's really high quantity of different art styles that have come together for this game.
That reminds me of something we talked about in our Outward review, which is how the game has a single art style. There's a unifying art style to everything, and you can tell that, but it feels like the beings in the game have like different art styles. Like there's the different factions create different armor with its own art styles, and the ancient groups or the Star Union created things with its own unique art style. The bugs have their own unique look to them, but it all does feel like it's got that same art style, and that it was like there was a somewhat of a vision across the whole art team.
They all definitely seem like the type of things that you'd think you'd see in the setting that they're in. Like, when you see any of these groups running around through a destroyed city, it kind of makes sense.
But yeah, and I'd say most of the time, if you look at this faction and you're like, oh, an Amazon, you know, they better be able to ride a T-Rex or something. Like, most of the time, you're gonna, if what you can think of is gonna be there. And obviously, you know, the imagination is a huge thing. There's all kinds of things you can think of, but what I'm saying is each faction and its units have a wide variety of things, and there's a lot of interesting things, from large grotesque monsters to armored vehicles, giant mountain crushing vehicles, that
steampunk type machines.
That's a good point.
You got the weird biodomed fish that are
the
somehow controlling. No, there's the Amazon's ships have a fish inside of like a weird aquarium and are controlling the ship. And then you got crazy alien creatures, then people that kind of look like exactly what you'd expect future humans to look like.
One thing that does make me want to bring up is there's some like the proportions of units is completely off. Like most infantry, just regular people, will be like twice as big as a car, or like just standing above, like hovering over a car, basically way taller than it.
Yeah. And
just overall proportions are not very good, and they're off. Yeah, but for this kind of game, it's kind of hard to do that. It's kind of hard not to have the proportions being off. And it doesn't bother me. It hasn't diminished my experience with the game too much, I would say.
Yeah, everything has to be able to fill its 1 hex space, but that kind of it makes it to where the higher tier units that are supposed to be these giant things that people can ride in generally are not nearly as big as they are in their like canon.
And they may not have. I mean, they're usually pretty powerful, so they do have that impact, I suppose. But they don't have that visual impact that you want from them.
Like
these mountain crushing machines.
Yeah, the mountain crushing
about.
Machine that's only slightly larger than a person.
Right.
Or the ships that are supposed to be ridden in by a crew, but only have the same size as a person.
Right, right. So while the art design for the units is really good overall, one thing that is not very good is the animations for the units. Most of the animations are decent to poor, I would say. There's some really rough animations. There's some decent ones, and a lot of them don't really line up very well.
Yeah. It's like you can usually tell exactly, for the most part, what they're doing.
Yeah,
but
you can tell what they're doing. It's not...
they doesn't look very great.
Yeah. It's not confusing, but it's...
Yeah, they reuse animations for a lot of units, like all humanoid units. Gumby doing similar animations, but there's some where it is kind of a little bit confusing as to what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
But that's very rare. But the fact that there's any at all that are like that needs to be noted.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of the time you're going to be fast-forwarding things, though, just to make it through combat, so you're not even going to be seeing much of the animations. But continuing from that, I want to talk about projectiles and explosions, which are mixed, about the same, decent to good. I wouldn't say they're bad. I wouldn't say they're bad.
Yeah.
Lasers look nice. Psionic damage has a unique little purple thing going on. Chemicals, the poison, that has a nice little green, little green ball.
There's projectiles that arc, and that arc looks right. It looks like it's hitting where you're aiming, and like a lot of projectiles are straight shooting though, and that's not really hard to do baseline animation. Like a lot of things are like kinetic projectiles, like bullets look very basic. You kind of see like yellow lines go from gun to target.
I mean, there's not all that much else you can do.
There's not too much you can really do about that.
Explosions are surprisingly satisfying. They don't look amazing, but every time there's an explosion, it's pretty satisfying, although that comes from the sound effects, too. We'll get into sound effects later. When talking about the projectiles, sound effects are pretty decent and do help them, but we'll get into that more later.
Well, I'd say the explosions usually look good, and yeah, the sound is good, but sometimes you blow up like a huge thing, and the explosion's the same size as if you blew up something smaller.
Yeah.
Even though the explosion looks good, it's like, they really couldn't have just scaled that up to the size of the thing you're blowing up.
Right.
But I kind of understand, since everything has to be under the one hex, they don't want to make an explosion too big and confuse people with like how big the animation is covering way more hexes than it's affecting or something.
So overall, art design, decent. It's pretty mixed bag. Decent art design to some more poor things. Some things that aren't quite up to snuff. But among its peers, I would say it's pretty high quality. Alright, I think we've talked about art design enough, though. So let's talk about the campaigns in the game. So there's a number of campaigns. There's like 2 for each faction, I believe, in the base game. And overall, they're basically just tutorials for each faction. For the most part. Like, you can get a lot of fun out of each of these campaigns. But really, yeah, they're just to get to know how to use each of the factions and each of the secret techs. So the campaigns consist of a pretty decent story, there's a good amount of story. You have like a unique cutscene at the beginning, and there's a decent amount of dialogue that you'll go through, and you'll have a few different options and choices throughout your story. And these aren't just like these aren't fake choices. Like there are some pretty interesting and big choices that can lead to different things. Like in the Kirko campaign, which is the Bugmen, you have a choice where you can end up. You start off this campaign as Synumbra, being your secret tech, which we'll get into the specifics of that later. But through the campaign and through your choices, you can change or keep your secret tech to a number of different things. In the next campaign, you will have a different one. And so we do have choices with consequences, and the writing is pretty good. It's not like an RPG or anything. This isn't like too high quality a story, but it's interesting enough to give a little extra to the gameplay. Give a little, I don't know, a little extra to the gameplay. Yeah, expand the lore and make you feel more accomplished for what you're doing.
Yeah. And voice acting, it's kind of a mixed bag.
There's not much of it.
Sometimes. But generally the voice acting is okay. It's just every once in a while you get a little bit of weirdness.
And there's not much voice acting either.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's nothing really like great when it comes to the voice acting. I wouldn't say there's any standout performances or anything in this. And
yeah. I think it's like in the DLCs, I think that with the Shikarn, but that's like probably the best, but that's only a very, very little bit of recorded voice acting, and then it's just all sound effects.
Right. So overall, the campaigns provide interesting, unique scenarios with unique objectives and choices in them, with an interesting enough story to make the gameplay feel a little more meaningful. But overall, it's just a couple missions to get you used to that faction, to that race. And that's pretty much all it is. I wouldn't say it's the main thing that you come to the AOW for. Although, I could see you playing through all the campaigns and like being done with it, feeling like you're satisfied, you got your money's worth, even just from playing those campaigns.
Yeah. But I think that one of the best things with this game is the custom game creation, playing multiplayer with somebody else.
There are some problems with multiplayer we'll talk about later, but yeah, I would say overall custom games, whether multiplayer or single player, is where you're going to get the bulk of your time with this game. And
in the creation of these custom games, you can select from a series of different worlds, and those are going to generate a roundabout different kind of experiences. Like, you're going to have a setting of a normal world that's going to have a good mix of urban and rural areas, where you're going to have some forest and some like ruined cities, and it's pretty well balanced. Then you have imperial worlds that are mainly ruined cities with very little wilderness.
Okay, but I wouldn't say that necessarily. The actual changes are: Frontier World has lowest amount of resources, Imperial World has the normal amount of resources, and then Capital World has higher resources. That's like the main changes, isn't it, though?
No, they also affect the sector generation. So it does directly affect how many forest sectors versus ruined sectors there are based on these planets.
Okay.
It does more than just the resource effects. But I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I had forgotten to mention that. Imperial and Frontier have a different disparity of resources. Like, Imperial's going to have resources on most sectors. You're going to have some kind of landmark. And then Frontier worlds have way less landmarks and way less urbanization. And then there's Is it ravaged?
Capital.
Oh.
You forgot the capital worlds too. Those are have the most amount of resources in urban
I may have
areas.
messed up. I was saying Imperial World. That is the normal world. I meant to say Capital World.
And then ravaged worlds are exactly what they sound. They're just like messed up, barren, not very many landmarks.
They have the highest rate of barren and volcanic landscape, which we'll be able to talk about more later, but they have almost no resources across the entire planet, and it's going to be really, really difficult to try to build up an army in that world type. Then there's also Tomb Worlds.
We'll talk about those when we get to DLC.
Okay, then.
When talking about the base game, different worlds, the main one that we usually played on, I think most of us, is just the normal Imperial world. Honestly, Frontier, Capital, for the most part, it seemed like to me, Capital, you have high resources, high landmarks. If you want to play a faster game where people get access to more stuff quicker, then you would usually pick a Capital world, I would say. And an Imperial world is in the middle, and then a Frontier world you would usually pick if you want things to be more difficult and take a little bit longer. Although you can change all this when you get into the deeper game settings. And so we can talk about that if you didn't have anything else to say about the worlds.
Are Conquered worlds from a DLC or from the update?
DLC. They're from the DLC.
Oh, I thought they were from the update. But, yeah, deeper game settings, I think we should move to that.
Yeah. So we have all kinds of settings in this. You got map size, game length, all kinds of different settings to customize your world, and like we said, the speed of the game, the difficulty of your enemies, and the rate at which they attack or move, how aggressive they are, basically, independently of their difficulty. And overall, you can customize your world and your game to be exactly the way you want it to be. You can customize every facet of the game.
Yeah, you can change the amount of large and small landmarks. We can talk about landmark types more later, but you can customize that. You can customize the amount of teleporters, customize the exact percentage rate for different sectors to spawn, customize how many marauder spawners there will be.
And so what we're saying is this is you can customize every bit of this. The custom games are well done with how many settings they have.
And you can, this is in the same settings, you can also customize some stuff to do with heroes, like how many times they can level up. And you can make a really big difference to how the game plays with combat cards, which can make it to where you're allowed to auto-combat a combat scenario rather than manual combat it. Generally, in normal settings, they're not important at all. You don't need them and they're not in the game. But you can make that decision in these settings.
And that usually would be for multiplayer, right? The combat cards to just...
yeah, I believe it is.
To sort of limit how often people can go into tactical combat, right? Is how that works?
Yeah.
Just because if you are playing a multiplayer game, then tactical combat can really...
It can drag on.
Yeah, if you do it a lot. But talking about that, we can move into the multiplayer settings. The biggest setting, I would say, for multiplayer is whether you want to play a turn-based game, a simultaneous turned game, or an asynchronous game. And so, turn-based is just, you know what that is. It's turn-based. Everybody takes a turn. You go on your own turn. You wait on the other player's turn. But you can also play this asynchronously. So you both don't have to be on to play. One person can come on, take his turn, and then hours later, your buddy can jump on if you're playing online, and then take his turn. And this works pretty well, although if you're on console, or depending on how powerful your PC is, the first loading screen to get into this game could take a decent chunk of time, which can really discourage you from jumping on just to play one turn. And the other setting we have when it comes to playing multiplayer is simultaneous turns. And it's nice, and it's what me and Nate played most of the time when we were in multiplayer, because with basic turn-based, one person is just sitting and waiting while the other person takes their turn. And sometimes these turns can get to be pretty damn long.
When did you want to talk about some of the flaws in this?
And we can talk about it right now. We can talk about the flaws with simultaneous turns.
Well, one flaw with most of the multiplayer tends to be that no matter what kind of game you've selected, there is definitely server problems with every single one of them. And simultaneous, it seems to have the most often out-of-sync problems that we've seen. And you have to reload the game and usually restart a turn, but sometimes it'll be in a loop where it just constantly is getting out of sync. You can't fix it. But simultaneous, on an actual, a purposefully put in function, there is one problem that we see occasionally, and it's practically how fast one player can select something, and their ping is taken into account a little bit with that, where he was moving his armies away in this example I'm going to bring up, while I'm trying to move armies in, and before he could get one army to start moving, because only one army can move at a time, I was able to attack it and was able to beat it in combat, and that made his overall amount of forces significantly weak enough for me to completely turn the tide just because of his unit not moving fast enough.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems with simultaneous turns is that even though you're supposed to be able to do everything simultaneously, and you're taking your turn simultaneously, there can only be one action happening at a time. If somebody's moving, you can't move. If somebody's attacking, you can't attack. There can only be one action going on the board at the same time. And another strange thing is the computer players, not the... You know how 4X game works, I'm sure. You have NPC marauders and factions, but there's also computer players that are along with you. With them, they will be able to move all of their units if you're playing in simultaneous turns. They'll play simultaneous with you, and they'll be able to move all their units before you can move a single one.
Yeah.
Because they're the computer characters, and so they're much faster than you. They can move their characters much faster.
They don't have to worry about human reflexes. And
so we just see, overall, when it comes to war and just fighting other players, the simultaneous turns can cause a lot of issues. If you are going to play simultaneous turns with another person, or with multiple other people, I would recommend enacting a rule where nobody can attack until, everybody confirms that they're all out of movement points. You at least give the other guy a chance to use his movement points that he has before you go and attack him. But that's just a personal thing that I think,
Well, I definitely see the issue with the CPU moving their units all, immediately. And they queue it up. They're perfectly timed, able to take the very small gap before another one's able to move its units. And it kind of causes a little bit of lag, too, with the amount of stuff going on in the beginning of a turn. It's really hard to do anything at the very beginning of a turn. But playing asynchronous, it's kind of like playing by yourself generally at that point, unless you both can hop on. And then turn-based, it's fun in person. It's not as fun not in person, because some turns can take so long before they're able to finish their turn.
You can also have lopsided turns where one person might be doing better than the other, or one person might have been set back, and so one person's turn's only taking like 2 minutes and the other person's is taking like 20 minutes or something like that.
I knew that after waiting a good 10 minutes that I felt pretty unfulfilled when my very next turn took about 5 seconds to change one thing.
But yeah, so that's some of the issues that can come with the multiplayer. But overall, there is a lot of fun to be had with the multiplayer, despite the problems.
I mean, my criticism of the turn-based and asynchronous would probably be the exact same criticism I'd give any game, because if a game has turns that can last a while, turn-based can get boring. And asynchronous, any game that's asynchronous, which I haven't really played a lot, if both people aren't on at the same time, it is really just like playing against CPU practically, except they might have an edge because, you know, they're a person.
The one thing is, though, is that simultaneous turns. It's a great thing to have, but I think they could have did it better. I think they could have avoided the problems that they have.
Maybe one thing that I just thought about that could have been a little bit better is if it would be simultaneous for human players, and then turn-based for the CPU. It would reduce the lag and make it to where you can actually start your turn when the turn starts instead of waiting till the computers are done with their movement.
And I feel like there's no benefit to the computer players going at the same time as you, like there is with a human player.
Yeah, there's no real benefit in that instance. And they already move pretty fast, even though later on they can have so many units and so much going on that they can bog down the turn. But they can still move fast enough to hurry up and get through a turn-based game. So it's really best if just the human players would have been simultaneous.
Yeah, absolutely. So continuing with setting up your custom game and some of the settings that go along with that, we'll talk about victory conditions. So all of these are optional. Well, I mean, obviously you have to have at least one victory condition for somebody to win. So we have 4 different victory conditions. The first of which is Conquest, which involves either you taking out all of the other players in the game or conquering a certain amount of sectors. And you can do that while still having a few allies and not conquering everybody in the game.
Yeah, and also for the amount of people you're in alliances with, the amount of sectors needed to win will increase. The percentage required gets higher, dependent on the amount of people in your alliance with you.
And the second victory condition is Doomsday, which involves you going through your secret tech research tree, which we'll talk about later. But basically it involves you using your resources to build some kind of doomsday machine, depending on your secret tech, that you have to research, obviously, before you can put your production towards building these large buildings. It's very similar to the Space Age victory in Civilization.
Yeah, and then after building these machines and activating them, a special effect depending on the special technology you're using happens to the rest of the world, and
then you have to defend them for a certain amount of turns before, and if everybody else has to try to attack you, right, and destroy them.
Everyone who's not an ally will have to try to destroy them, and the amount of turns that you need to defend them for is dependent on a setting that you can change. But I think there's only like 3 or 5 different settings of how many turns it takes for a Doomsday victory to work. It's usually around 10 to 15 turns for it to work.
And then lastly, well, not quite lastly, but you'll see why I said that in a second. We have the Unifier victory, which involves you getting to know the native factions and becoming allied with them. And we'll talk about what exactly native factions are. They're different than players, even computer players. But you'll have to ally with 2 of these native factions, which is a pretty heavy task. And then you also need to research this certain operation that you'll have to activate. Which, do you need...
Do you need what?
Do you need to be allies with other players as well?
No, that is in the Allied Victory, I believe. But
Okay.
if you
can be
yeah,
allies with other players, so
and they'll win too if you're in an alliance.
Okay.
But if you can get the native factions, which it's not always to, there is an actual way that can change, and it's either dependent on the amount of native factions on the planet or by a setting that you can change with the native factions. But you need to research tech and use something called a doctrine, which we can get into later, that gives practically a turn counter that has to count down before you win.
Similarly to the Doomsday.
And you have to hold 2 capitals of these native factions, dependent on how many you actually need to be allied with.
Which is a large task. And the last one is the score victory, which everything you do gives you points. And this, if you set a time limit, then whoever has the highest score at the end of the game will win.
Yeah.
And this is basically just for if people aren't working fast enough to the other 3 victories. Really, if the game is sort of stagnating, you can set this to where it only lasts a certain amount of time.
And also, there is one kind of victory condition that we didn't really count because it's not really important, but it's allied victory, where if your ally wins, as long as you're in an alliance with them, you win too. And
you could set whether or not that is allowed in the settings.
Yeah, we didn't really count as a victory condition because it's not really its own thing too much. It's more of reliant on the other conditions to be met.
And so in each of these victory conditions, I will say one of the biggest differences between this and something like Civilization's different victory conditions, the Unifier and the Doomsday, which would be equivalent to the Unifier, I think it's called, and the Space Age victories in Civilization. In AOW, you are still going to need a pretty well-sized army, I would say, to achieve either of those victories, because as a Doomsday, if you're going for the Doomsday victory, you're going to need to defend those towers, like I said. And for the Unifier victory, you're going to have to complete missions for these native factions. And these missions will, a lot of the time, involve you killing marauders or just some kind of enemy. And so you're going to need an army. No matter which one of these victory conditions you want to take, you're going to need an army of a decent size.
Yeah. I think that one of the easiest games that I've been able to play before is I allied with every other CPU player, and then they, without my help at all, killed the only one CPU player that I didn't ally with, so then we all won. And that is
altogether
possible.
You had conquered the right amount of sectors.
No, it's just because we had no CPU player that was counting as an enemy in the game anymore. Since everybody was an ally, then there was no longer a fight needed.
And that's why you're allowed to check whether allied victory is a thing or not.
Yeah. It kind of was the only game that I didn't necessarily need to have a big army for.
Right.
But you generally want to have a big army if you want to try to win the game.
And I will say, in my experience with all 3 victory conditions at normal lengths, like normal amount of sectors, normal amount of native factions, and normal amount of time on Doomsday, Doomsday victory is the easiest one every time, I would say. Me and Nate usually would put Doomsday on a long timer rather than a normal timer and keep the other ones on normal timers. That's just how we played it to try to... I would say we tried to achieve like the best balance we could when we played, which, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be looking for that going into this game. You might want a power fantasy, or you might just want to get absolutely crushed.
No, I think that you could... Like, you have to go through all of your tech tree to do your secret tech Doomsday victory, which takes a long time, for sure. But I think you could do the Unifier earlier. You could start it but the turn counter to win a Unifier victory is already longer than Doomsday. That's why we never really mess with that setting too much. But Doomsday, once somebody can get it, if it's on normal or like quick speed, then someone can very quickly win the game with the Doomsday.
I would say overall, unless you're allying with everybody like you did that one game, Conqueror is probably the hardest of the three to do. But it's also probably the most satisfying.
Yeah, when
victory
you crush all your enemies, it definitely gives you a nice feeling.
and Score is probably the opposite. It's the least satisfying.
Yeah, I never play with Score victory setting personally, but I understand why it's there. It's kind of like when you play Monopoly for a day and everyone has to just give up and say the guy with the most money and property won.
It's a good safeguard against a game dragging out for too long. But then again, if you're playing multiplayer, then both players usually, at least in our experience, I mean, I don't know who you're playing with. You might be playing with a real asshole or something. But both players are usually going to try to keep the game interesting and keep things happening, I suppose. But maybe not everybody. So
one downside, though, I'd say to Score victory is that the CPU, even on an easier difficulty, is able to very quickly get their score up super high.
Sounds like Nate just sucks. Even though he's better than me at the game.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how many times have you beat me at this game? I don't even remember any of them. But, the CPU's at least in early to mid game, so if you set the score to, like, the game ends on a pretty early turn, you're likely to not beat the CPU's score since they know how to score the quickest. But towards the end game, you can usually build up a pretty powerful civilization that can't really take you.
It also feels like, and maybe this is due to not too smart AI on like normal and hard, it also feels like their score, even if their score is way above yours, you still might be able to take them.
Yeah, I've noticed usually when I like gain vision on them, which we can talk about what that is later, so I can see all their stuff. I can see where their units are at, and your might is a thing that goes towards your score, shows how strong your armies are. I've noticed that they have a lot of armies, but all very dispersed often. And you can usually take them even though their might and their score is way higher than yours, just because they don't keep their armies together and they stay way too dispersed.
And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I will say the power numbers for units don't always line up when it comes to tactical combat. Manual combat.
Especially since there's pretty good counters to different things. Right. That's not always reflective in army power, but it is reflective pretty well in auto combat. Which,
we'll talk about it later, but that could be... that is a little bit of an issue with auto combat. But we'll talk about that later. That wraps it up on victory conditions.
Now let's start talking about how you make your civilization and the different settings that you can adjust. First off is your faction or race, and
AOW gets this right.
Yes, this is one of the strongest areas of this whole game, and you have a very colorful variety of races with the Devar, which are Russian space dwarves that have steampunk outfits and vehicles. The Vanguard, which they're your basic human. There's not too much to say about them. They have some twists in their lore if you look at some of their articles that match up with their units, but for the most part, they look and feel like basic future humans. But then you got
fascist. Fascist future
I forgot
humans.
about that. They can run pretty good propaganda.
Yeah, it's like
to
Starship Troopers.
Yeah, then you got the Kirko, which are the psionic bug people. the Assembly, which are robot zombies that have like a punk style to them.
They want to assimilate basically everything, every organic, into their cyborg armada.
And then you have
Syndicate.
the Syndicate, which you were talking about human fascists before. These are just purple slave owners practically, and
they're more like ultra corrupt capitalists.
Yeah, with indentured servants, and I mean,
I guess
they're
that's
practically
not capitalism.
They're practically slaves. Yeah, some good old late 1800s capitalism.
Right. And yeah, like you said, there's many colorful different things and different groups, and we talked about in the story and setting part how they twist these sci-fi tropes.
Yeah,
and we see that with all the factions.
And we also got the Amazon, which are a bunch of buff ladies that have biological weapons and lasers. And that's another thing that we should know, is that your race that you choose is going to impact your weapon types, which every race has two. We can get into the weapon types.
Each race has a unique weapon types and two elemental weapon types, which are shared among different races, but each race gets two specific ones. Like Kiriko gets psionic and biological damage, and the Syndicate get psionic and electrical damage. And each faction has unique pros and cons. They have unique weaknesses as well as unique strengths.
Yeah.
And each element has a strength is strong against certain creatures and weak against others. Just a very basic elemental system, but there's a lot of different elements, and it works well, the elemental damage system.
The next layer in making your civilization.
Before we get to that, I just want to say that each of the factions, each of the races, their story, their lore fits very well with their gameplay. We see a cohesion in that really advances your immersion and makes you feel more like whatever fantasy they're trying to portray. Like the Kiriko having unit tier 1 and 2, which is mainly infantry units, spawn way faster, and you can turn production into food, and so you just feel more like this ravenous horde spawning quickly. And the Syndicate, you feel like you're manipulating other factions with your advanced influence, and the way the indentured slaves work is pretty interesting and provides a interesting gameplay element, which, while also improving their the characteristics of their story and their lore, and really going in line with it. And each one provides, I think, a really unique, interesting science fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, the Assembly definitely also feel pretty good with their practically getting research off of the corpses of enemies and being able to process colonists into production, things like that. This should also be noted, before we get into doctrines later, factions will have a whole list of their own unique doctrines. That's another reason to choose certain factions, is because if you know what those doctrines are, you're gonna be able to know that you can get this special benefit in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just say overall, each faction provides a good chunk of unique gameplay.
Yeah.
Unique units, unique research options, unique modifications to your units you can make.
And after an update that added residential sectors, that added jobs that are specific to factions that do specific unique resource production. There's some for the Syndicate, for example. if you build a residential sector, then it gives a special job that the syndicate can get more influence per turn at a cost of energy. There's some that produce 2 separate resources at once, and it definitely is a worthwhile update to the game that they made, especially since it corresponded with one of the best strong suits the game has, which is a civilization builder.
Right. The uniqueness of each of these factions as well.
Yeah.
And I'll also say that you start out with a single faction, but you can, while you won't receive all the benefits of it, you can conquer other factions and take their units and some of their mods, which you can research. And that's what helps with balance, which we'll get into a little bit later. But even though certain factions are going to be weak against certain other factions, like the Vanguard has a lot of vehicles and stuff, and might be weak to the Assembly or anybody that has electrical damage, which can destroy their vehicles. But even as the Vanguard, you can get somebody else who has defense against electricity, or whatever you need defense against, whatever you need damage against. You can pretty easily get that type of damage.
Yeah, and
which helps with balance.
There's also plenty of mods you can get either through randomly succeeding at an encounter. You can randomly get a mod, or
research.
Yeah, research, and then you can pick it up off of certain enemies if they're special mods. There's all sorts of ways you can get mods that can help protect against certain factions, but there's nothing that really beats a good rush, though, before someone can set up defenses.
Yeah.
Like, if you know somebody next to you is weak against your faction, you might as well try to rush it quick before they can get those defenses.
Yeah, so while I would say that some factions are weak against other factions, some factions, maybe they're better off in the early game rather than the later game, I would say overall, because you can take over other factions, that there's a decent balance between all of them.
Yeah, and
they all have their pros and cons.
Yeah, it definitely isn't too easy to rush anybody, like, most of the time anyways, but it is possible. But by late game, you can, and it probably would be a good idea, start really setting up defense against factions you know you're weak to. Most of the games where I know that I'm weak to a certain type of weapons, I usually try to, stack up those type of defense mods on my units.
But let's continue.
Yeah.
So after you pick your faction or race, you're going to pick a secret tech. And this is a pretty interesting thing. This is, it's almost like a mini race. A mini faction within your faction. It's a unique research tree that has units, modifications for units, and operations, which are sort of like spells in a fantasy game that you would use.
Yeah.
Just unique little one-time, or unique little powers you can use that aren't connected to any specific unit.
Yeah.
And they also, they contain unique units, powers, and heroes, weapons, all that.
And the different kind of vanilla secret techs there are is Promethean, which is focused around fire
and destruction.
Destruction.
Oh, and also, like we talked about in victory conditions, what your Doomsday weapon will be, which is how you get the Doomsday victory, is determined by what your secret tech is. And, you can obtain it by getting towards the end of your secret tech research.
Yeah. I believe that what the Prometheans get is some kind of...
I think they basically just destroy the planet.
They just burn all the enemies on the planet, practically. I don't remember the specific effects before it happens, but then there's...
And each one of these secret techs also has a specific element. There's one for every element.
Yeah. Then there's Synthesis, which they're, kind of... integrating
into stuff.
Yeah, hacking. They're integrating into network. So all their end goal is to try to integrate all of the minds of the different races into a computer. they're kind of like a step above assembly. Assembly kind of just wants to turn everyone into weird half machines. This wants to actually upload everyone's consciousness into a network. But then there's
Void tech.
yeah, Void Tech. They use portals a lot and melee weapons for their first units, but later their not secondary, their later tier units, I mean, have range, but they use a lot of portals and time loop type technology.
Yeah.
Like they'll go back a turn to the health they had before.
And an important thing to note while we talk about that is that there's also economical advantages you can get from your secret tech.
Yeah.
Like with the void tech, you can have stuff like teleporting your food between colonies, which will decrease the amount you lose, which we'll talk about more about how exactly that stuff works later. But
I
that's
didn't
kind
even
of
know
example
about that effect. But then there's the Celestials, which are like using psionic power to sway ideology in a way of other factions. You can steal colonists, and
they come across as very like priestly.
They're like holy version of psionic.
Yeah, it comes out Catholic-y, in my opinion.
Catholic-y. Then there's, I can't remember what their doomsday weapon does, but then there's a Synumbra, which is like the opposite of the Celestial when it comes to psionic power.
The dark side of psionic energy.
They summon creatures from other dimensions.
Horrors.
Yeah, horrors from other
like,
dimensions.
like
and can do operations.
Lovecraftian type stuff.
They can do operations that make it to where when you finish off a unit the enemy has, that it turns into some evil creature.
Yeah, like a purple ghost man.
Yeah, purple ghost man. And they're pretty interesting. They kind of got like a dark mage type vibe to most of their units. Then I feel like I'm missing.
Lastly, we have the Xenoplague.
Oh yeah, the Xenoplague.
Biological plague.
Yeah, and that one has the ability to spread an infection onto units in combat, and then they'll have a unit called Pustules come out, and then those, through experience, don't they become the higher tier units?
The higher tier units.
I know that secret tech relatively is kind of not that great generally.
No, I think it can be pretty good.
I have heard that it is the worst of all of them.
Wow.
And from my experiences playing as it, your likeliness of getting a Pustule that lives long enough through a lot of fights is usually low. It's way easier to just spawn in the higher tier units straight from like the time that you're able to research the technology for it.
So interesting in theory, but maybe kind of poor in execution.
Yeah.
So
I think we covered those pretty well.
Yeah, one thing that all these secret techs do is they provide variety of customization, right? You have your races, which give you specific bonuses, and then you can pick a secret tech that either aligns with your race and what they do and the kind of element they have, to sort of strengthen that, even, push your element forward even more and sort of strengthen what you already have. Or you can try to fill your weaknesses. You can use a combination of like synthesis and Kirko, which would be a strange thing. You have these bugs that are now hacking and controlling vehicles or taking over vehicles, or just being good against vehicles and robotic enemies, and where they wouldn't be regularly.
And there's also some interesting cohesion with like Synumbra and Syndicate. Your initiates for Synumbra, which is the first tier unit, and I think they're called Malictors, which is a second tier of unit along the secret technology tree. Those get buffs from having initiates in their army or in the same combat scenario as them, not initiates, indentured. So if you have like an army of indentured in the same combat scenario as your initiates or malictors, then they get a special buff. And there you see a lot of cohesion between these secret techs and factions or races often.
And it also pushes further out of the generic zone, I'll call it. It makes you, or it adds another layer to your whole experience, whereas before you were a crime lord syndicate leader that has a bunch of slaves and stuff, but now, on top of that, you're a crime lord that wants to spread a intergalactic plague to destroy the world, or
worshipping evil extra-dimensional space demons.
Right. Or we could just go full Catholic Church and go Syndicate and Celestian, and then you just have the full Catholic Church. You have manipulation and money stealing, and
we would like to note that this is talking about medieval Catholic Church, not modern Catholic Church, for the most part.
The only difference is I never hear about any syndicate with little boys.
Oh no, please.
Oh, the Bravosity does not stand against the Catholic Church or for the Catholic Church.
Yeah, we would like to remain neutral. We just like making jokes here.
So moving on from civilization customization, we're going to talk about your hero and the customization of them. So after you pick your faction and your secret tech, you will get to customize your hero.
Yeah. Some of the starting stuff in the customization is like, is your hero a person who has martial tradition or is a merchant scion, things like that. That's some examples of stuff that you can select. Those have a cost of a certain amount of points that you can use up to customize your hero.
There are hero traits.
Yeah, hero traits, and then flaws.
And there's also weapons you can get.
Yeah, then
for your hero.
Then weapons or vehicles.
Yeah.
And like some of the traits though are you get I think more influence for quests or things cost less. I'm not entirely sure what it was.
There's also a lot of like starting bonuses which come from those traits. As well as weapons.
Yeah,
like
one of them was colonist cryopods. He starts off with some colonists in cryopods, so you get more colonists to your first colony,
which allows you to grow your first colony much faster than someone who didn't get that.
Yeah, and then also the weapons. You can go with the basic weapon that is unique to the race, or you can go to a weapon that is unique to the secret tech, which is usually a little bit better, and then beyond that, you can get even better weapons like snipers you can start with, or vehicles. But those get more expensive the better the trait or weapon or vehicle.
You start off with like 3 points?
Something like that, yeah.
You start off with enough to allow you to get an okay trait and an okay weapon, or a good trait and a shitty weapon, or a good weapon and a shitty trait or no trait.
But then there's the flaws, and the flaws actually give you points if you take them, and one of them is cruel. Cruel makes it to where I believe morale is worse in your army at all times that has the hero, but that one's pretty okay one to take. It's only affecting one army, so it only gives you 1 point back, but then there's also some traits that affect how much food you're bringing in, which will affect all colonies, and that is actually a little bit more damaging. That's worth 2 points. So then you can have other better starting bonuses.
Most of both the traits and the weapons and the flaws, all 3 of these, only really matter in the early game.
Yeah,
So
generally. Um, every once in a while, though, it is nice to start off with a hero that has like really good weaponry, because then you can go through most of the first encounters really easily. But as time goes on, you would probably be able to get to that weaponry or better, anyways. Um, there's also traits like kleptomaniac takes away from energy. That
the
one's one of
best
the
flaw.
yeah the best fall to have, and I believe there's different traits to take away from each of the
Resources.
Yeah.
Um, and another thing that all these add, which we'll continue talking about, is that sense of immersion and further pushing your group from being generic.
Yeah.
Getting farther
Yeah.
away from being generic. Now you're insect man who wants to spread a deadly plague and also is a kleptomaniac or
Yeah.
insane or whatever, cruel.
Already their factions and secret tech were already interesting on their own, but now you're past 2 layers deep, one layer with faction or race, the other layer with secret tech. Now you're to your hero customization, starring bonuses and falls, and that really starts to add. I'd say that counts as even more than another layer of customization to your experience in the game.
And it's just options, 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 options.
Yeah.
You just like you can choose to create whatever kind of match you want within the match. Like you have so many choices and so many options on how you want to handle just the game, how you want to play the game and go through it.
Yeah, this is definitely just the customizability is definitely the strong suit of this game.
Yeah. And moving further into hero creation, we have the actual customization of your hero. This is all cosmetic, but it's actually surprisingly in-depth, the amount of customization options you have for your hero.
Yeah, there's not a lot of, like, faces, but there's a lot of headgear, masks, torso type clothing.
You get to choose your character's
Or armor.
stance.
Yeah, stance, portrait. So, like, when they see just a little small picture of your leader, you can have them looking all
Change
menacingly.
the angle. We actually made a guy that looked just like a Dragon Ball Z villain.
Yeah. There's a lot of things. Skin tones.
You could change the background they have when somebody else goes to make like diplomatic relations with your character, they'll see your character with their background and they'll be standing in whatever pose you picked, and it just furthers that customization and that uniqueness you feel with the group and the people, the hero you've chosen.
And then there's names. Sadly, in multiplayer, it doesn't let you have a completely custom name, but their list of names are pretty hilarious generally.
Tick Jiglux.
Yeah. And then they have the flag you can customize with a symbol and the primary and secondary color.
And then that color will show up on your borders as well of your colonies.
Yeah, and also on a few units, sometimes color shows up, and on your hero, his clothes will usually take the color.
Which is cool. It's just a nice little details.
Yeah. Are we good for that?
Yeah, I would say that wraps up the customization of your faction character and all that. So we can get into the actual gameplay. We can really start getting into the actual gameplay. And even though when you first get into a game, the first thing you're going to be greeted with is the 4X style Empire gameplay. We're going to talk about the manual combat, which when you get into combat on the Empire, the large-scale map, you can choose auto combat or manual combat. So auto combat is what you would usually see in like a game like Civilization or even Humankind. It takes the general power of your army versus the general power of their army, rolls some dice behind the scenes, and tells you who wins. It's pretty fair most of the time, I would say.
It does take into account counters to a certain extent. Like, if they are all weak to arc or electrical damage, and you're all equipped with electrical weapons, even though your power might not be greater, you could still win. The extent of this, I'm a little fuzzy on, but it definitely does take it into account, because there's been plenty of times where I have less power than my enemies, and I still win in an auto combat without even losing a guy, because I was just well equipped.
But if you go into manual combat, then you're going to be playing a XCOM style combat, where it basically zooms in on the location that the space on the board, the 4X board, that you are fighting in. And the way this works is you have what? You have like a 1 hex radius.
Yeah.
With 7 spaces altogether. 1 in the middle, and then 6 along the outside. Yeah. Or is it 8 along the outside?
No, it's a hexagon, so
it's a hexagon.
6. Yeah.
Okay. So you can have up to 7 armies in one battle, and each army can have up to 6 units. And so getting into this manual combat, these XCOM style battles. So, like I said, you have 6 unit armies, up to 7 armies. And that includes both sides. So, once you're in battle, the maps are a bit small, I would say. Would you agree?
Yeah, they're not too big, but they're not gonna be something you can cross in only like a couple turns, but they're not gigantic.
I would say most ranged units are only 1 turn away from being able to shoot somebody. Like
at least from one of the edges where an attacking army would spawn to the defending army, which is in the center of the map, it does usually take only about 1 turn of movement before somebody's within range, but it would probably take 3 turns of movement for someone to be in range of the enemy all the way across the map.
Right, okay. So each unit, no matter which one they are, has 3 stamina. Or AP, whatever you want to call it. I'm not exactly sure what the game calls it. But, and so you can make, there's a few different things you can do with that 3 stamina. No matter what, when you attack, it will be your last move, right? Either attacking or going into defensive mode will be your last move. Now, you can move with 1 stamina, 2 stamina, or use all 3 stamina. And different abilities, different attacks will take 1 to 3 stamina as well.
Yeah.
So if you have an attack that takes 1 stamina, you can move 2 stamina, and then use that last stamina to attack. And this is how every character works. Although some units can move farther with 1 stamina than other units can move with 1 stamina. And there's also what are called repeating attacks. And so that means if you have 3 stamina and you use this repeating attack, it's going to take 3 shots if you have all 3 stamina. If you have 2 stamina, it's going to take 2 shots. If you have 1 stamina, it's going to take 1 shot. And each of those shots has their own roll to where know if they missed or hit, and is going to do its own unique amount of damage, obviously.
Yeah, and there's plenty of different abilities and powers. We can get into that later, but they usually take either 1 or 3 stamina. There's usually not any powers that are repeating, so that's
Just
usually
attacks.
something that's going to be the last thing that you do in your turn. It would have been nice if you could use a power and then use the remaining amount of AP you have, but I kind of know what they're getting at with that. And then you were talking about defensive mode. There's actually certain units that have different special effects with their defensive mode. Like the Devar have a defensive mode that I believe gives them cover.
Yeah.
And then there's evasive defensive mode that lowers hit chance on
Rather
every
than
incoming
damage.
attack. Yeah.
There's the Syndicate ships, which when they go into defensive mode, they get a huge portal around them in a 1 foot, one space radius.
A big like shield bubble. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that they've integrated into the defensive modes of different units. And there's also mods, I believe, that can affect some of the defensive mode.
Talking about defensive mode, we'll get into the cover system.
Yeah.
So you have full cover and half cover, and that's pretty self-explanatory. It makes it harder to hit depending on whether you're in full or half cover. Each weapon has a certain range, of course, and your enemy also needs line of sight. There's also flanking, which if your character is facing the opposite way of an enemy, or if they get behind you, and they will do extra damage. And you will also be able to turn your characters at the end of any move other than attacking. If they attack, they will end their turn facing wherever they attacked. But if they're going into defensive mode, you can then turn them whichever way you want to avoid being flanked.
Yeah, and full cover will usually block line of sight. Generally, for most things, you can't even make an attempt to attack someone behind full cover. But half cover, it's something people could shoot over, and it won't affect the person who's in cover's attack hit chance, but will affect the chance that they get hit. But those also, certain units have different effects when in cover. There's some units that get better aim when in cover. I know that's a ability you can pick up on heroes when they level up, but there's, I believe, also mods that affect that too.
There's vehicles that can't take cover and instead provide cover to other units.
Usually anything large enough to provide its own cover can generally destroy half cover when it rolls over it. The cover was definitely a very nice touch to this game. And flanking's also a pretty nice touch as well.
Yeah, flanking can...
you can flip an entire scenario around by flanking somebody, but also it doesn't just apply being shot from the back, also the sides, as long as it's not anywhere, like, practically within their 3 hexes that they could be facing.
Yeah, I think it's a little too wide.
It can be,
way you can get flanked.
It can be a little wide, for sure.
And especially with how small the maps can be.
Yeah.
And how claustrophobic things can get. Like, I feel like it can be really easy to get flanked.
Yeah. But a really good way around getting flanked is using Overwatch.
Right. Which allows you to cover an area. Basically, you can cover a large area where your character can see. So you basically just pick a direction, and instead of attacking on their turn, they will cover that area. And if anybody moves or attacks on the other player's turn, then the character with Overwatch will attack that character. Similarly to all kinds of strategy games. XCOM is what I was thinking of. XCOM has Overwatch. And yeah, basically, if the enemy moves on their turn after you went into Overwatch, you will attack them.
Yeah.
And this can be used to cover your flanks, or just be used to cover any enemies moving in towards you.
Yeah. It saves the amount of AP you had during your turn, and that's how much action points or stamina you have while in Overwatch. If you have a repeating weapon, that will take up the amount of stamina or AP you have to shoot, like 3 shots if you have full AP. It will do that while in Overwatch. Your repeating weapon will shoot the number of times you have AP, and then if it's a single shot weapon, you're only going to be able to really shoot one person in Overwatch, in your Overwatch, and I think it's a really good way to do crowd control. Make sure that either enemies within your Overwatch site aren't going to try to move, or that they'll be punished for it, or to make sure enemies don't try to get in your line of sight at all.
One thing I like about Overwatch in this game compared to XCOM is there's a heavy aim percentage penalty in XCOM, and I get why they did it, but it just feels better to use Overwatch in this game. And I think there's some other things that are balanced differently in XCOM, and that's why they do that with their Overwatch. But I think in this game it works well, and it's very satisfying defensive tactic.
Yeah, and there's also different units have different effects with their Overwatch too, and abilities you can pick up with your hero as they level up that affect Overwatch. Just like everything else in combat so far that I've stated, things get affected a lot by what units you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm talking about these small battlefields, talking about how they're a little bit cramped. One thing I want to talk about what's on the battlefield, and we have cover, really just two things, cover and explosives. So we have things that can blow up, like there's explosive barrels, vehicles, some other things I think, but that's really it. Cover and explosives is the only kind of interactable thing you'll see on the battlefield.
Then there's cover that you can blow up without the need of environmental explosives. I mean, you can use environmental explosives to blow up cover, but you can also just shoot a missile at somebody's half cover, blow it up, and now they no longer have any cover.
Which that's cool.
It's pretty good. I think that the way that they're laid out, also, a lot of the arenas are laid out in a very enjoyable way, and it's like their layout mechanically changes dependent on what kind of battleground you're on, practically. Like city streets, you have some long, less covered areas with mainly broken down cars and stuff to provide cover, but then you have buildings that provide a lot of cover with fallen pillars and all sorts of stuff like that.
One thing they sort of screw up on, they don't really do right, I feel, is verticality.
Oh, yeah.
There's not much of a... There is some kind of bonus you get from being higher than the other player, I feel like.
I don't think that there actually is.
I don't know, the angles and the hit percentage when you're higher than... Especially when someone gets close to your higher position, when they're right next to you, it starts to get real weird the way... the percentages end up working.
There's a lot of battlegrounds or arenas where that is not even something that needs to be factored in at all, because there's a lot of very flat areas. But then,
which is another flaw, I would say. How many flat? I mean, it's mainly on one plane.
It makes sense when you're in like a desert, but actually, the desert's one of the places I've seen cliffs the most. But it makes sense when you're in a place that needs it. But there's also, I remember seeing one where it's just a small corner of a broken down building and a street intersection, and it's all flat. And another one where it looked like a gas station, kind of.
I would also say the way they're designed, there's not too much variety in the way they're designed mechanically. I would say that overall, you're probably going to be using, like, if you take the same units into like 3 different arenas, right? You're probably going to be using the same tactics with those units in all 3 arenas. The arenas don't really change how you're going to play all that much.
I'd agree, because most of the arenas don't have any specific unique thing to them. There is actually some, I forgot about this, there is some environmental hazards that are not just explosions. Like, there's one in, I think, Void Tech landmark, where if you shoot this singularity or something, I can't remember what they call it, it applies a special status effect to people around it. And I think it can damage them and teleport them randomly.
Yeah, you're right.
There's things like that.
You're right. There are some unique, more unique interactions in those locations on the, but they're rare.
Yeah, and also you practically use most of these unique environmental hazards the same as if they were explosive.
Right.
Like, you'd still shoot at them just to deal area effect damage mainly.
Some spaces, some battle arenas also have unique things, unique hazards that'll be going on because of buildings that may be on there, like a what do they call it? Something defense.
Yeah.
Platform. There'll be like missile launcher that every turn you'll have a random unit get hit by a missile or a storm or something like that. Which those are interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, for the most part, there's not any special things with most maps. It's mainly different form of layout of cover and explosives. I do think though,
and then artistically they're each pretty unique.
I do think, though, that from a mechanical perspective, the biggest changes are whether you're in an urban or rural area. Because in the rural areas, it's like very random full cover and random half cover. But like in urban areas, it's not as random anymore.
It's a large strip of half cover, full cover, rather than like
random
trees placed everywhere. I get what you're saying.
But it's mainly that type of layout. There is some full cover that can be exploded too. Most half cover can be, but there is very rare when full cover can. And mainly in colony sectors, you'll have walls that are like, they look like they were just put up or something. Those can be blown up completely. And I think the destructible environments work very well with a game like this. Because you're not going to be able to just destroy them by shooting. You need a specific type of unit to blow it up. And I think that is a really good choice on their part.
But I also think it further muddies how distinct each of these battle maps are. Because the one thing that really makes them distinct is where their cover is placed. But it doesn't. But it does matter. But the fact that you can just blow it up makes it matter less where specifically it is placed.
I think,
although I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing that you can blow it up. I'm just saying that's a result of it.
I was gonna say though, like if they didn't have it that way, then I feel like the utility of their units would be less varied. And I think the utility of their units being varied is actually one of the strong suits of this game for sure.
And so talking about the map layout and trying to get to people through the map, right? We have melee enemies trying to get to ranged enemies, right? And we have the difference between those two. Those are the two main types of attacks you're going to be doing. There's different types of units, which we'll get into here in just a second. But even in an even broader sense, we have just ranged versus melee. And you should know what that is. Obviously, ranged is. I'm just gonna assume you know what that is, listener.
Well, I'd say this game, it's definitely harder to win with melee units generally. There are certain melee units that it's not as hard to play with, but on average, ranged units tend to be better because even weak ranged units do pretty good. Weak melee units tend to not do very good. There are some melee units, though, that can do a teleport, like right up into the ranged people once they can get within, I think, 7 hexes. Those type of melee enemies tend to be pretty good, but
also usually the melee guys have something special to them that tries to make up for them not being ranged. Like with the Kiriko, you have like Swarm Shield, which that applies to all of them, so that doesn't really work for that specific thing, but that is something that helps.
But I also wipe out a Kiriko infestation real quick with snipers.
this is a good point to talk about something I probably should have talked about when we were talking about stamina, and that's stagger. So a lot of attacks can cause stagger, which will take down stamina for players' next turn, and this can be detrimental. Snipers take 3 shots to, or most snipers take 3 AP to 3 stamina to shoot their sniper at full power. So if they get staggered with 1 hit, bam, your next turn, they're not going to be able to snipe anybody. Your melee unit isn't going to be able to, reach the person they want to reach and then get a few attacks off. They're going to be able to do a lot less when it comes to stagger. And when it comes to melee units, one thing that they all are going to need is stagger resistance. Because if they get staggered, I mean, they're screwed.
But an advantage to melee units, though, is that almost every melee unit's attack applies stagger. Almost every melee unit has pretty high impact on their attacks.
And they also get melee Overwatch, and this is a passive ability that you always get. So anytime anyone comes near your melee unit, they aren't going to be able to walk away, or they aren't going to be able to move away from your unit without getting attacked through melee Overwatch. And also, a lot of the time, if they miss their attack on your unit, they're going to get hit with melee Overwatch as well.
Yeah.
And that works really well, because you can run up on a ranged unit, and even if you can't get that, even if you can only get 1 attack off, or you can't get any attacks off, that ranged unit isn't going to be able to get away with you without at least having a chance of being attacked by your melee Overwatch.
Yeah, and it seems like melee in general is something that is way more rewarding once you can get up to them. It's usually really hard to get up to the range, but once you're in there, you're dealing tons of damage. But another thing also, I think that we should expand a little bit on the stagger. There is an actual impact rating that is matched up against the stagger resistance of a unit, and you can keep increasing that impact rating, and unless a unit is completely there's like stagger resistant to the max where they cannot be staggered at all, then you're going to be able to stagger almost every unit if you can max out your amount of impact on your weapon.
But you can only attack, 1 person with 1 unit a turn.
Yeah.
But still.
Yeah. But
it's still a powerful thing to do.
Vehicles aren't going to get staggered.
Explosives can still stagger people, though, as well, so you could attack more than 1 unit. You could throw a grenade.
That's true. You can have a grenade that staggers someone for all of their stamina.
And there's things like flashbangs, where that's their main thing. Like, they don't even do much damage, they just stagger a whole group of people.
Yeah, but vehicles can't be staggered generally. They're impervious to being staggered. They can, though, have other effects happen to make them lose their AP, but I just thought that we should talk about the fact that the impact versus stagger resistance rating is always taken into account. You can actually make a hero with such high stagger resistance that melee units don't really even affect them too much.
But talking about, we're talking about how vehicles can't be staggered, and so it's a good segue into talking about the different kinds of units. And we mainly you have infantry, vehicles, and aircraft, as well as naval crafts, but we'll get into naval combat here a little bit later. So this is all pretty self-explanatory. Infantry is robots, just whatever isn't in a vehicle and is a smaller, human-sized unit.
Human or beast that is not too large. Some of the animals are large enough to count as vehicles.
And most of the time, an infantry is 1 unit, and an infantry is actually like a group of 3 people. But they all take up just 1 space. It plays as 1 unit, but it shows it as 3 people just to give you a little more fantasy that you're leading this army.
Yeah, that has multiple squads and everything working together.
Vehicles are a bit larger. They can be giant bugs, giant animals, like Nate said. They can be robots and mechs, or just tanks. Anything like that. And then you have aircraft. You can have flying animals. You can have planes, helicopters, gyrocopters, all kinds of crazy stuff.
And all this stuff has its own way of getting affected by certain attacks. Like most vehicles, it does matter if they're mechanical vehicles or not, will get certain resistances to some damage types, and it also matters in their stagger. There's a few ways that they affect just different ways they either attack or attacks that happen to them. And aircraft, when they die, they usually fall to the ground. Unless it's a flying animal, it usually blows up when it hits the ground.
It can damage
friendly
or enemy units.
Yeah.
There is some of the unique things. Infantry are the only ones who can take cover, right?
Yeah.
And vehicles, some of them can be cover, and aircraft can't take cover because they're in the air. You can't land with your aircraft. There's no really reason for that. You can fly above infantry or vehicles, like right above them on the same space. Even enemies, you can have, bombers, you can have, there's like kamikaze planes that are built specifically for ramming people with the Devar.
Yeah.
And there's a wide variety in all of these.
There's a vehicle for the Vanguard that spawns in drones that will blow up once they reach an enemy. There's a lot of ways these interact with each other. Yeah,
all of the vehicles, the aircraft, the infantry, with all of these different types of units, though, we see unique powers that all of them can have. Like you just talked about, that land vehicle that can summon aircraft, small drone aircrafts. There's teleportation. There's enemies that can dig. There's healing. There's shields. I mean, there is
literally just about every single unit in this game has a unique power or unique to them set of powers. Sometimes some powers are shared between different types of units, but
especially if they have the same element.
Yeah, but usually one of them will have another power the other one didn't have, or things like that in general. Usually they are unique and play unique completely.
And there are ways that each of these become unique. Like you were talking about how a mechanical vehicle versus a vehicle that's actually a big creature that somebody's riding or something. Psionic powers aren't going to work on the mechanical creature, on the mechanical vehicle very well. But the creature, the organic living creature that has a mind, is going to take a good amount of damage from psionic or maybe even biological, depending on what creature it is. Obviously, each of these beings have their own resistances. Each of these units have their own resistances and strengths, mainly following elemental lines.
Yeah, and there's powers like arc bolas are going to restrict movement or completely lock in place units. And I think arc bolas can work on some vehicles because they're electrical. There's things where you can hack the enemies. There's just about every single unit has its own special power. Very few don't have a power unique to the unit or unique set of powers.
And another way that we can get these unique powers are through mods. And each unit has 3 mod slots, which you can place mods, which you can gain from research and development. And you get mods that can do all kinds of unique powers. You can change the element that the unit does damage with. So turn a creature from a biological damage or physical damage to electrical or ballistic, or physical and ballistic are the same thing. I don't know why I said that. Change it to like fire or psionic, whatever. You can change the elements. You can give them unique powers like tunneling claws that let them dig.
Giving them more resistances or increasing their damage, changing the damage type, and also giving them unique abilities and powers. And that's it.
even most of the ones that give unique powers also give defense as well.
Every single mod gives either an increase to shield, to armor, or to damage. And by the way...
to health, I believe, too.
Yeah, and to health. I forgot about that. Armor and shields, those ratings are different per unit. I think we completely missed this, but...
it's fine, I don't even know.
Armor and shields get affected by different weapon types or elements.
That's what I figured, but
yeah,
I didn't quite know the specifics.
Armor, I forget exactly which one protects from what.
Right, but I imagine ballistic,
then there's
biological
mods,
would take out armor.
Yeah, there's mods that actually turn biological powers into corrosive. And, it gives a corrosive, special trait to your biological attack, and that'll melt through armor easier. Then there's some that have shield penetration, things like that. And that's another way that they've changed up how the units act. So not only do you have the whether it's infantry, vehicle, aircraft, whether it's biological or mechanical or cyborg, now you have how much armor versus shields it has, or if it has any of one of... they always have one or at least one of the two, but sometimes they're missing one of the two. Sometimes they have both.
And this can be a lot as well. It can be a lot to keep track of and to understand, but I think the game does a really good job at separating all these things and breaking things down, and
you tend to not even need to worry about it too much.
On the normal difficulty.
Yeah, at least on the normal difficulty. You can very easily just see, oh, it's adding either shield or armor, and it doesn't really matter which one it's giving me. I know that's better than not having less of either of the two. But
you can get into the nitty-gritty of it if you really want to.
Or another thing is some mods can add even more impact to attacks, so you can stagger enemies more. Or some of them add more stagger resistance as well.
And one thing I've noticed is that mods can make units fill dual roles. Yeah. You can have a guy who... you can turn a damage-dealing infantry into someone who's also a healer. Or just give them some kind of support ability, or give your support more damage, or things like that. Just make them fill dual roles.
You can also get a lot of these mods from combat encounters and beating enemies and going into landmarks. You can get a lot of unique mods, or mods that you can never research from a lot of these encounters. And there's some really wacky ones out there, like a penguin egg. An interdimensional penguin egg is a mod. It's just... is
it a summon?
Yeah,
summon an interdimensional penguin?
Yeah. There's just so many unique abilities that can be gained through these mods, and unique powers with the characters. This is another amazing point of this game, is there's so many unique ways of either... you can make it unique through the insane customization, or just they've already made very unique units.
And so one thing we see with the combat in general, but also it really is made a point of with the mods, is that it's much more about creative combinations of powers and mods and units to play against your enemy's weaknesses, rather than just overwhelming them with forces. It's much more about creating a good army that can play against your enemies and using them well, rather than making a large army.
Yeah.
You can make the biggest army in the world, but if you're fighting somebody who all these units are weak against, it's not going to help you that much. You can overwhelm them with force, but it's much more difficult.
In a lot of the encounters I've had with this game, I have seen that a good army, where everybody's optimized pretty well and I'm using units I know I can play good with, I can take out 2 and sometimes even 3 other armies that are up against me. Completely full armies that aren't optimized but are still powerful units. and it usually takes quite a lot of armies, even if I'm optimized, for them to take me down without having significant losses.
This is a big game with a lot to talk about, but we're sitting at a little over 2 hours here, so we're going to go ahead and end this video here. But come back in part 2 of our Age of Wonders Planetfall review discussion. If you enjoyed the video, and drop us a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to the Bravosity if you want to see part 2 of our Age of Wonders review discussion, some of our other review discussions, or some of our analysis videos. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.